We will go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight in the seas and the oceans. We will fight with growing confidence and strength in the air. We will never surrender. We shall defend our island home, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight in the landing grounds. We will fight in the beaches. We will fight in the towns and the villages. We will fight in the fields. We shall never surrender. And if the British Empire was to last another 1,000 years, they would say that this was their finest hour.
Fergus Keane here, and welcome to my review of Darkest Hour. Churchill is a really towering figure in British and indeed world history, and for me, it's his spectacular and inspiring speeches that stand out as his true weapon in mobilising an entire nation against the fascist dictator that was sweeping across Europe at the time. In the film, one of his enemies remarks, he has remobilised the English language and sent it into battle. And it's true, it's hard not to be roused and inspired by his words and the indomitable tone that he adopts. In more peaceful times, we might wince at some of the consequences behind the words. For instance, the film refers to the 20,000 troops that he sacrificed at Calais in order to defend Dunkirk. It's also hard to overestimate the context of the time. Churchill did represent the last line of resistance and defence to one of the worst tyrannical dictators in history. He was all that was standing between Europe and complete collapse.
I speak to you for the first time as Prime Minister.
The Germans have encircled 60 British and French divisions. We are looking at a collapse of Western Europe within the next few days.
How long have they got if we don't rescue them?
Maybe 2 days. We would need a miracle to get our men out.
You have the full weight of the world on your shoulders.
We're facing certain defeat on land, the annihilation of our army, and imminent invasion.
The title is slightly odd. I'm surprised at the choice of Darkest rather than Finest Hour, which would refer to one of Churchill's greatest and inspirational speeches. Churchill he's a huge figure in British nationalism, and in 2002 he was voted the greatest Briton of all time. Given the rise of British nationalism at the moment and the exit from the EU, it's very opportune time for a film on Churchill to be released, and indeed it's the second such film in 12 months. It is though notable that Churchill was very much in favour of EU cooperation, in contrast with many of the Brexiteers. It's interesting to note that in some ways there was a proxy battle going on in Europe in terms of language and rhetoric. On one side you had Hitler, who was renowned for his rousing speeches and incredible displays of theatrical propaganda. Britain did need an orator like Churchill to counterbalance that, and he certainly did. And his speeches, certainly you can understand how they would have roused and inspired troops going into battle at very tough odds. Sometimes the real enemies are not the foreign dictators, of course, but your own party colleagues.
Why have I been forced to send for Churchill? His record is a catastrophe.
Much like the infighting in the Tory party of the last 3 decades that we've seen, particularly over Europe. And the film does explore that subplot of Churchill's enemies within his own party, such as Chamberlain and Halifax, who repeatedly attempt to trap and undermine him as from the minute he takes over as Prime Minister. And it's very true today in current British politics. Churchill's hedonistic lifestyle is certainly heavily portrayed in the film. We see him entertaining whiskey and cigars for breakfast, a lifestyle which is much sneered at by his more conservative colleagues in the corridors of Westminster. There is also a slight nod and hint towards his depression, though the director is quite light on this and doesn't explore it much further. Gary Oldman's portrayal, I found, can be a little bit over-comic at times. That would be my only complaint about it. Tending to portray him as a character, as a hapless clown at times. At one stage, we see him on his hands and knees talking to the cat, for instance. Remarking to the king that he can't meet him at 4 p.m. because that's the time he takes naps. Happily, this comic portrayal isn't overly portrayed. We see his relationship with the king transform from one of distrust and possibly outright contempt to the point where the king rescues him from his own conservative rivals. So his relationship with his political colleagues is a subplot and theme that runs throughout the film, and usually he's portrayed as winning over initially very frosty relationships. The witticisms that he scatters throughout are very entertaining, where he refers to his colleague, a particular colleague, as a sheep in sheep's clothing, and Halifax as the holy fox. As well as seeing the political and the orator and the statesman side of Churchill, we do see the personal side also. There's one particular scene, perhaps a slightly contrived scene, where we see him take his very first ride of the tube on the London Underground, where he seeks the views of the common man as to whether to negotiate with Hitler or to robustly take him on. They're resoundingly in favour of the latter. It's that kind of meeting Joe Plumber that's so often staged by modern politicians, desperate to appear in tune with the real people. Here, Churchill is in no illusions as to how distant he is from these people, though his moments with his secretary show a softer interaction with a member of the proletariat. Overall, I thought this was a very entertaining and engaging film, which captures the paranoia of the era and how this somewhat unlikely hero emerged from it. It resonates just as much today as the current affairs in Europe are dominated by the exit of Britain from the EU and the rise of British nationalism and American nationalism and isolationism. To quote Churchill himself, this is not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end. It is perhaps the end of the beginning. See you next time. Bye-bye.
You cannot reason with a tiger when your head is in its mouth!